Hi BookTube, I'm Mike Frost from the Postmodernist Poetry Prognosticator channel. And today I thought I would do a tag, the 52 Nifty Bookish Questions tag, created by Adrian and Dalton over at Strip Clever Lit. I was tagged by Jay Shay, who I will also mention in the 52nd of the 52 questions I'm about to go through. So there's 52 questions in this tag, and I'm not a talker, so we got to get moving. So I'll try to go through. There's only one place I'm going to pause in this because it talks about poetry, and I can't just breeze past poetry. So we'll go on with the rest of them. What book are you reading right now? Well, right now I'm reading Bernardine Aravesto's The Emperor's Babe. I will be doing a review on this probably the end of the week. It's the second to the last book I'll be reading for February's Black History Month. The next book after that would be The Poet X, which I think is another question in this thing. What was the last thing you highlighted? I haven't highlighted anything in years. It bleeds through the page and I just don't like to highlight, so I haven't highlighted anything in years. What do you plan to read next? Well, that was The Poet X. That's the next book in the series that I'll be doing for Black History Month. One fiction writer, living or dead, with whom you'd grab a drink. Fiction writer, Hemingway. Probably Hemingway. One non-fiction writer, living or dead, with whom you'd like to grab a drink. Joseph Campbell. I'll also mention him when I'd like him to do my biography, so I'll mention him again later. One poet, living or dead, with whom you'd like to grab a drink. Oh, that is so hard. Yeah, that's Yeats. I'm going to go with that. One booktuber with whom you'd like to grab a drink. All of them. Let's get together and have just rounds and rounds of drinks. I, like most booktubers, don't actually drink. So, Emily Dickinson or Edgar Allan Poe. Mood is everything, but I'm going to go with Emily Dickinson on that. Hemingway or Fitzgerald. Easy. Hemingway. Love Hemingway. Jane Austen or Charles Dickens. I'm going to go with Dickens on that one, although I do love Jane Austen. Harris or Hitchens? Well, I'm an apatheist, so those sorts of arguments bore me. I'll just pass over that one. Stephen King or Michael Crichton? Well, I'd rather stick something in my eye than read another Stephen King piece, so anybody besides Stephen King. Bret Easton Ellis or Chuck Palahniuk? Both have intrigued me, but I'm not enamored of either. I'm going to go with Ellis, just because I think his sentences are better. It's a pretty weak argument, I get, but okay. Kurt Vonnegut or John Green? Vonnegut, easy. Shakespeare's poems or plays? I'm going to go with his plays. I like his poetry, but his plays are great. Adrian Fort or Dalton Gentry? Well, how does one choose among the Greek gods? One simply worships at the appropriate shrine and hopes not to anger any of the gods. So I'll just leave it at that. Cormac McCarthy or J.K. Rowling? I'm going to go with Rowling. Only because when my oldest daughter was 10 years old, was 9 or 10 years old when those books first started coming out, and I used to read them to her. So I've read all the books to my oldest daughter at one time or another. And when we got toward the end of the series, she was reading with me, so we were swapping voices back and forth. Good memories with that. Hannibal Lecter or Voldemort? Well, despite what I just said, I'm going to go with Hannibal Lecter. It's creepy. T.C. Boyle or George Saunders? Well, I'm going to withhold judgment. I'm going to go with Saunders for now, but I know that the folks over at Strip Cover Lit are going to do a series on T.C. Boyle, so maybe they can convince me otherwise. I just don't find his characters believable. I don't think he makes his characters very well, draws them out. Good writing or a good story? I, like most people that have answered this question, say you can't have one without the other. But as a person that reads primarily poetry, I'm going to go with good writing. YA or children's lit? Children's lit. Irony or humor? Well, I'm going to go with humor for two reasons. One, if you're just talking about general irony, that's included in humor. If you're talking about postmodernist irony, I'm so through with that. I'm so tired of postmodernist irony. So I'm going to go with just humor. Sci-fi or horror? I'm going to go with sci-fi. Fantasy or nonfiction? I hate when people ask me these kinds of questions. I'm gonna go with nonfiction for now. Rather find a new favorite contemporary writer or a new favorite old-time great? Well, I'm the postmodernist poetry prognosticator, so I've got to find that new favorite contemporary writer. Okay, so here's where they ask the two questions on poetry: sonnet or haiku, and then question 27, sestina or villanelle. Well, most people are familiar with the sonnet and the haiku, less so with the sestina or the villanelle. If I get the question, if other people's answering these questions very well. To me, when it comes to poetry, it's all about form and function. What you're writing matters. So the form that it takes makes as much difference as the actual words you're using. So most people are familiar with the sonnet and the haiku. Some things need more drawn out than haiku, but if you can get a snapshot of something, why draw it out into a sonnet when you get the haiku? For the sestina or villanelle, so both of those are old French. The sestina, I think, is a little older, goes back to the troubadours. Forms, they have repetition in them. They're drawn out in repetition. So I've read great ones of both. In fact, I read one. Well, yeah, I have some here, but we got to get through these questions. Form and function, they got to match. If they don't match, it's no good. So how to choose between that, it depends on what you're trying to say. I was tempted to go through some poetry, but I'm going to withhold from the temptation for the sake of speed here. But I'm going to be reading, as soon as I click off on this video, I'm going to have to go through them. Okay, spend an evening in a library or bookstore is question 28. Bookstore, definitely bookstore. I like to be able to take something home with me and keep it. Magazine article or Wikipedia article? Wikipedia. Dictionary or encyclopedia? Dictionary. I love words, so I love to read all about the word, not just the definition, but all about the word. So dictionary. The writer I would like to write my biography. And I'm going to go back to Joseph Campbell on that. He was a great mythologist. He wrote The Hero of a Thousand Faces, which George Lucas used to, it was inspired by that to write the Star Wars series. He wrote a lot of books on comparative mythology. If anybody could make my life interesting, it would have to be Joseph Campbell. Question 32. I do not highlight in my books, not for years and years and years. I don't like the effects of highlighting. I do not write in my books. I do write, now I collect books as well as read a lot of books. So if it's a book that I'm collecting, I collect a lot of first editions, mostly fiction authors, some poetry in first editions, but I'm not too keen on it. But most first editions I won't write in. Anthologies, I write like crazy in them because I want to be able to come back and find an author I want to follow up and dig in more into their poetry. So I do write in my anthologies and sometimes just books I pick up from the secondhand store and want to go through the poetry, and I'll write like crazy in those. Earliest memory of a library. All right, so in another video I explained I was not a reader as a child. But I do remember, I'm from Lowell, Massachusetts, and I do remember the Lowell City Library. Big, beautiful, old building that I remember going into as very young and just walking around in awe of the architecture. Not so much the books. I wasn't really that much concerned with the books, although they added to the ambiance, I guess. But I do remember the Lowell City Library with great fondness. It's a beautiful building. I don't even know if it's still there. I haven't been back to Lowell in 20 years or so. Last time you went to the library? Well, I just moved to this house. So I moved from one side of the city to the other. So I went to at the beginning of this year, so a month ago. And I went to see the local library here to see what it had. I was not real happy with the very small branch library that we have here in this particular part of the city. So it was about a month ago. Have you ever accidentally stolen books from the library? No. When I would have been of age to have accidentally stolen something, I wasn't going to libraries. Ballpark. How many books do you own? So when we moved here, I turned over about 6 to 8 boxes of books to the local used bookstore here, put them back in circulation, as I like to say. So I am down to probably between 200 to 300 books, something like that. How many books do you think would make a reasonable personal library? I, like most folks that have answered this question, don't think there's anything reasonable about having a library. Reason has nothing to do with the number of books you own. It shouldn't. If it did, nobody would own any books. Question 39. So there's Sense and Sensibility in sea monsters, and Pride and Prejudice in zombies, etc. How do you feel about this phenomenon? There's an audience for just about any kind of writing. So if there's an audience for it and people enjoy it, cool. For a horror trope you would like to see get more love. I don't read horror for the most. I can't remember the last time I read a horror. The Relic would be when it came out, a long time ago. So I don't really have an answer for that. Something that you think gets underutilized in science fiction. I do read, I wouldn't say a lot, but I do read a considerable amount of science fiction, and it runs the entire gamut. I can't think of anything that I haven't found in science fiction that I would look for. So I think it covers all the bases there in science fiction. I'm guessing. Flash fiction, form of literature or just a short story? Well, I've written and published several flash fictions pieces, and I write them as short stories. I think if I don't think of them that way, then they end up being slices of life and not really stories. I think flash fiction should be a story. So I'm going to go with short story on that. It can't be a form of literature unless you write it like a short story, I guess. Odd way to answer that question. I get it, but okay. Follow me. 43. If you could own one book from all of history, what would it be? First folio from Shakespeare. That's an easy one. 44. Audiobooks. Same as reading? I've never actually listened to an audiobook. Ever. So I really don't have something to base that on. I'm going to assume hearing is different than reading, but I've got absolutely no basis on which to make a judgment. Most literary songwriter of your lifetime. Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. What writer embarrasses you the most because you haven't read them? And I agree with probably most people that have answered this question, that it's really nobody that I'm embarrassed about. I mean, I read fairly widely. I guess I feel badly that I have never gotten through James Joyce's Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. I love his short stories, The Double Enders, and I one of the questions is I'm going to mention The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is a book that changed the way I read, but I've never been able to get through his Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. So maybe someday I'll get through that. 47. What writer embarrasses you because you've read too much from them? None. What I like to read, I like to read. And I guess many people that see generally what I read find it odd when they see me reading something from Robert E. Howard or Edgar Rice Burroughs or some Star Trek book or something along those lines, Firefly book. I'm not embarrassed by it. I like what I like. What is a biography you're looking forward to reading? So when I started this channel, I thought I better bone up on some of the poets. I read a lot of poetry, but I've never read a lot of biographies of poets. So I've made it a personal choice to start looking for biographies of poets. And one that I found here recently was a biography of H.D. Hilda Doolittle, the Imagist poet, or the poet that comes to my mind when I think of Imagist. And I love her poetry. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's probably going to be one of, I know I've read at least some other biography of Poe, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. But that's, I'm going to start that one with the series of biographies that I will be reading. 49. Do you have a dream reading cubby? Anywhere I am is my dream reading cubby. I can read anywhere, any amount of noise. Nothing distracts me from reading. So, anywhere. 50. We're getting there. Last literary phenomenon that really got your gears grinding. Now, watching some of the other folks answer this question, most of them, I guess most of them took it in the negative that, you know, this got my gears grinding. I was really angry about this particular phenomenon in literature. But for me, you mentioned gears grinding. The first thing that comes to my mind is steampunk. And I'm a huge steampunk fan. I've written a series of short stories. This is self-published, so I'm not going to talk about it. But I've written a series of short stories in steampunk and a novel, a steampunk novel. So I'm a huge fan of steampunk. So when you talk about gears grinding, that's what I think of, and it's a positive thing, and I like steampunk. That's the literary phenomenon that got my gears grinding. 51. What was the last piece of literature that changed the way you read? Now, that has been a while, but I can't remember what would have been the last one, but I can name a few books that have changed the way I read. When I was very young, reading poetry, when I got to Mallarmé's Toss of a Dice, and any of Apollinaire's poetry, those ones that really created modernism, because they changed the way we look at poetry, because they changed the idea, the premise of poetry from music as a basis to paintings as a basic. So it became the way we look at poetry. Those Apollinaire and Mallarmé changed the way I looked at poetry. Those two, of course, led me to T.S. Eliot, whose writings changed the way I look at poetry. And, of course, that led me to Ezra Pound, whose poetry I don't really enjoy. Well, his persona is a good one, but his thinking, not political thinking, but his thinking about poetry, and helping to create movements like the Imagists that I mentioned with HD, changed the way I look at it. As far as writing goes, novels go, I think probably The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I remember reading that and finding it so different from what I had been reading that it changed the way I look at it. And I read that one before I read Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, which would have probably had the same effect on me. But I would have to go, when we talk about the first, I would have to go with James Joyce's The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I don't know of any nonfiction that changed the way I read. So, okay, 52, we've made it. What booktuber have you been watching the most recently? And that's the one that tagged me in this thing, Jay Shay. I'm not trying to be a sycophant about this, but I watch a lot of the YouTube videos. I've been watching BookTube for a very long time, and I probably spread my time out equally amongst a lot of different booktubers. So I can't say that I've watched Jay Shay more than the other ones, but I find myself lately watching my feed, looking for his videos that he's doing on poetry. He's one of the many booktubers that have vowed that this year, 2019, was going to be the year that they got into some more poetry. And he claims to not be versed in poetry, not know a whole lot about poetry, and then he'll put out these videos that are just stunning in their insight into the poems that he's reading, remarkably stunning in his insight. And I find myself, every time I open YouTube, looking for his next poetry video. I'm gonna steal his format. I'm gonna steal ideas from him. It's just a matter of time before I get there as a booktuber. But if you haven't, I'm going to put his link below, but if you haven't checked out some of his remarkable readings on poetry, you're missing something there. I mean, he digs into it, and it's it's nice. It's just really, I look forward to every single one of his videos on poetry. I watch his other videos too, but as of course, I'm always looking for someone that's reading poetry. So he's the one that I'm scanning constantly, looking for his next video. Although I watch a lot of YouTubers and booktubers rather. So if you're creating content, I'm going to find you. So that's the 52 Nifty Bookish questions. Thank you, Jay, for tagging me. Thank you, Strip Covered Lit, for creating the tags and continuing to create these tags. I like watching these tag videos. They give me a chance to get to know these booktubers outside of their reading and just what they do, what they're like. So I thought I would try to join into that tagging community. I will tag some folks down in the remarks sections, but for now, that's my tag. Have a great day, BookTube.